The Gentleman, Season of Sunlight, Year 1.
He didn't really put up much of a fight, did he?
Leopold questioned his associates as he ran the circlet between his fingers. The old man who had worn it recently had been older even than him, wrinkled and infirm, and foolish enough to allow the three passage into his lands, little more than an enclosed garden surrounded by a once rich villa, and several far less prestigious houses for what Leopold assumed had been workers, or perhaps soldiers. Crimsolino looked up from where she was feasting on something, swallowing the fleshy material with an audible gulp before speaking in the dusky tone so unlike the vicious beak it came from.
No, sweet Leopold, not at all. Not nearly as much as you would expect one bearing the title of Earl, at least. A disgrace to all to the manor born. Yeah, well, we didn't need to actually kill him. Geez.
Mr. Mammon had been hiding behind a pillar the entire time, terrified and yet unable to look away. He had known Crimsolino before, though mostly by reputation. As a peddler of strange wares, and buyer of far more valuable ones, he had come to know the cursed Duchess, and perhaps even empathize with her a bit, if not exactly for her winning personality. But he wasn't a combatant, and though he had expected her to revel in the bloodshed, he hadn't expected the old man to. Leopold had entered with a grandiose bow, listing off a barrage of titles too quickly for Mammon to catch even one. The Earl or whomever hadn't seemed to register what was happening before Leopold had thrust his cane through the older man's gullet, and laughed as he collapsed to the floor. And now they were in an abandoned villa, the knights and servants who had sworn to live amongst it doing nothing to stick up for their liege lord.
Feudalism, man. Completely unsustainable.
Mammon muttered to himself, hoping that eventually Leopold would grow bored of using the old earl as a footrest, so he might be able to bury the man, and possibly check his pockets for anything of use. It wasn't if he'd need them anymore, anyway.
Oh, I don't know, dear Mammon. It depends on how you look at it, Herm.
Crimsolino murmured as she lazily circled the clean-picked corpse of the earl.
There is absolutely no rule in the island, here, and without rule, men like this come to power. Perhaps you knew him not, but he was ghastly-mannered and deluded, obsessed with the fear of an undead host that would never come. So although his overthrow was violent, it was also just and supported. If a chain is weak, after all, one replaces it.
Leopold tossed the circlet to the ground, and Mammon snatched it out of habit. It was cold, and made of a silver-grey wood, plated with argentium.
Do you like it, Toady? It's yours, if you don't mind the second-hand spoils of an unpleasant ruler.
It was something in Leopold's eyes. Mammon had known a lot of unlikable people, but Leopold was never smiling, even when he was joking. He was always watching, waiting for someone to mess up. So he could humiliate them, perhaps. Mammon couldn't understand what the old man wanted, but knew enough not to try to guess.
No, thanks. I couldn't pawn this for a sack of stale crumbs. Crim, you want it?
Crimsolino squawked, her neck elongating towards Mammon with an avaricious gleam.
Yes, naturally. Place it upon my noble brow. Oh ho ho ho. For a mirror, what I wouldn't give for a mirror. Not that such a trinket truly flatters my noble complexion, but it will serve as a stopgap until we mint our own coin and produce true fineries. Is that not so, sweet Leopold?
Kicking the corpse of the earl down the stairs leading up to his seat, Leopold gave a bemused nod to the crooning harpy.
Not that I plan to stay in this place any longer than necessary, but I felt it would be a good start to our relationship to show that I reward skill. I just assumed that anyone living in a nice house would have nice things, and I intend to put them to better use than the old coot ever did. Now then. Mammon, you have a nose for treasure. Where is it?
Mammon tossed a coin down to the ground, watching carefully for the gold strands of light that bounced back, and following their scent. Treasure is a subjective thing. You have to learn to blot out the sense of what could be something treasured by the people who frequent a place, or who hid it away, focus on the furtive sense of greed and avarice. Mr. Mammon's acquaintance, Madame Asmodel, never quite figured that out, being more focused on googly eyes at things in the first place. So it was with a degree of satisfaction that Mr. Mammon pried the fake bricks from near the villa pool, overgrown with moss and green water, and lay a brass chest at the feet of Leopold. Crimsolino appeared behind him in a rustle of red feathers and smoke, and whispered so quietly that Mammon couldn't be sure he heard her, or what she said. Laughing in her disjointed and screeching manner, the avian woman flew into the sky, feigning disinterest in the chest below. Leopold tapped it with his cane a few times, lips pursed.
You know, I always assume they'll be locked. I never assume they'll get waterlogged, or stuck shut. Why can't things ever be easy for once? At least I had no trouble with the undead, this time. For a minute, I thought that Mad Earl might be more aware than I gave credit. Mammon. A hand.
His ramblings suddenly growing razor-focused, Leopold and Mammon each grabbed an end of the chest and threw it into the wall, where it bounced off, unharmed. Leopold fumed while Mammon shrugged toothily.
Well, we tried. I guess that's that, boss. Unless you've got a secret skill set you want to tell us about, or you feel like lugging that with us until we find a locksmith. Honestly.
Crimsolino dove through the sky towards them, crashing near the chest with an undignified hiss from between her beak.
Two self-proclaimed gentlemen who cannot open the simplest of locks? What is this world coming to, that a mere fusion of metal and water is enough to thwart the will of men? Patience.
A razor-sharp talon tore through the lid, Crimsolino licking her beak hungrily as the chest groaned its resistance before spilling open.
Patience.
Inside were countless trinkets, some far older than the Earl, or even the villa. Mammon could evaluate one of the brooches at being at least a good 100 seasons past, and probably worth a small mint to the right buyer, or the wrong buyer sweet-talked diplomatically enough. But even as Crimsolino let out a melodious laugh and bathed in the gold around her, it wasn't that which Leopold sought out. He dug through the coins feverishly, finally stopping with a puzzled expression.
Harumph.
Leopold resisted the urge to laugh himself. His two lackeys already had their suspicions, of course, but they seemed loyal enough, and simple-minded. They would just have to do this the hard way, but if he had one virtue, Leopold liked to think he was patient.
There must be a land nearby, some place where the servants of this estate were drafted, and where the retainers would go for drink and entertainment, likely abandoned long since if this the state of their lord's manor. I wish to be taken there. Well, gee. Aren't you bossy, boss? Look, Leo. I'm not entirely familiar with the layout of the land, here, but, though I imagine you're right, just because you've got some kind of plan doesn't mean you can just order us around. Can't I, though?
Leopold responded quietly, taking a series of slow steps forward, his cane tapping against the stone poolside as he did. Tap, tap, tap. It was a simple cane, unadorned. And it still smelled of blood, and suddenly Mammon felt faint. Leopold said nothing more, simply smiling beatifically. Then he reached down, and ruffled Mammon's hair with the same unchanging expression.
Very good. Well, since we don't have an idea of the land, I suppose we shall have to wander until we find something of use or value. How droll.
Crimsolino, now draped in several necklaces in addition to the circlet resting uneasily against her head, rose into the air with a dismissive cry.
You never ask me for a service, sweet Leopold. If you but got on your knee and begged, I would do it gladly. As it is, I have to do it of my own will, simply because you are too foolish to think of it yourself. But you seem to forget that I have wings.
Laughing, the avian vanished into the distance, and as she did, Leopold smiled, very unpleasantly.
At some point, I shall have to defeather her for her impudence. Isn't that right, Mammon? Isn't that right?
Mr. Mammon didn't respond, and for a minute he wondered if Leopold might strike him. But the old man was deep in thought, and for that Mr. Mammon was grateful. Looking for an opening as they waited the return of Crimsolino, Mammon whistled to himself.
Lovely weather, then. So, what exactly is your plan there, Chief? It could never hurt to let your trustworthy assistants in on that, given that we are supposed to be your friends, you know. Help you in all that.
It was a guttural laugh, but Leopold eventually contained it and wiped a fake tear from his eye.
Absolutely right. How foolish of me. First I'm going to find a suitable place, extract everything of value and build a comfortable residence, and exist in a state of luxurious rule for the rest of my days. To do that I need a base of operations, power, and wealth, there is more, of course, to life, but it can usually be acquired with those things. Certainly you agree. No on 1, maybe on 2, and yes on 3. What a wonderfully diplomatic answer, though a better one would have just been yes.
Chortling to himself, Leopold didn't even wince as Crimsolino tumbled through the sky and landed onto his left shoulder, her claws digging into his skin reflexively. Though the cursed Duchess squawked in surprise and uttered a genuine apology, he seemed awfully amused by something, simply shaking his head.
Truly, I'm sorry. It was uncoordinated of me. I had a slight altercation with the locals, you see. But there is a perfectly flat plot of land village to the west, dotted with ruined foundations. Nearby is a tribe of stone people. They seems a somewhat degenerate lot, but that could be to our advantage. Shall we investigate further?
His answer was to walk into the distance, the large bird still perched precariously upon his clearly bleeding shoulder. Mammon watched them go in puzzlement for a moment, before he realized that Leopold wasn't coming back, and only stopped to grab his cart, mostly unladen with the spoils they had found as he panicked and attempted to catch up. The air was cool around them, and Crimsolino wasn't particularly fond of the cold. Back in the days when she herself had held title, and more importantly been recognized for her fairness in complexion if not rule, she had kept the palatial chambers heated with alchemical fire, and stained with the ashen embers of smoke. And the latter made her cautious of the ground they walked upon. It smelled of a fire unchained and let loose amongst the otherwise crisp air, the strange and unnatural gashes where no grass grew around the ruins of once great foundations, hinting that once, this had been a glorious settlement indeed.
Do you suppose you might wait up a bit, sweet Leopold? Dear Mammon is struggling to keep up with your every step, and though I admire the purpose with which you stride, the last thing I'd wanted to enter a potentially dangerous situation, split up and defenseless. Not that I would claim to know anything about such matters, of course.
Fluttering a wing like a fan, Crimsolino waited for a response that didn't come. Leopold was busy sifting through the few chunks of masonry still standing, although with some effort, back in that world of his own that so worried the ex-Duchess. It was not unusual for newcomers to ignore their new friends, but usually, they learned to share some level of happiness and adventure with them, however grudgingly. Her life had been lived amongst the manor-born. It didn't take much to see one who had plenty of ambition but no empathy at all for exactly what he was. Clicking her tongue, Crimsolino lazily drifted up and off the man's shoulder and into the slightly warmer upper air, finding a thermal to glide along. She watched as the jangling cheap wood of Mammon's cart slowly came into view, the peddler demon already out of breath. Laughing, she drew closer, and cooed cheerfully.
Greetings, dear Mammon. Do you always prefer to keep your allies waiting, or is it just your lot in life? Probably the latter. My back is killing me. What's the old man up to? He looks like he's seen a ghost. Possibly again. Honestly, I neither know nor care.
Sniffing, the harpy rested the crook of her neck under one wing.
What I do know is that the tribe I encountered fought furiously to protect this place. Perhaps because it had some kind of dungeon in it, you know, one of those musty and disgusting realms filled with disgusting creatures attempting to steal your hard-earned wealth and loot whatever is lootable. Monsters too, of course.
Mammon pinched his goatee, smiling wryly.
Sounds like a nice enough place. But while we're talking, just the two of us, Crim. Don't you think the new boss is a little violent? Dangerous, even? Of course not, you daft dear. He is charming, impeccably dressed, and well-spoken.
She replied without meaning a word of it. But Crimsolino had not been born into a position of wealth without learning to never voice your doubts aloud, even when the object of those doubts was clearly lost to his own interior world. And though her true thoughts believed the man they traveled with to be self-absorbed and manic of temperament, she was a duchess, and would not shirk her duty, regardless of form.
Tissue. Age, what? You sniffed.
The harpy continued to stare without understanding for a few moments, before hissing irritably.
Never you mind that. All I meant to say is that we should be cautious and judicious in all things, not that we should worry about the perfectly capable mental state of our sweet traveling companion. Look. Whatever you want to sound like you mean, and whatever you mean, I just want to know what you said earlier. I couldn't hear it because of how whispery you were, and...
Peals of laughter interrupted their conversation, Leopold limping over with blood-stained and scratched knuckles.
We've struck success. This is the ideal place to build a castle, perhaps, or a tower. Yes. Well, Mammon. Get to it.
Silence filled the air. Crimsolino tittered.
Well, Mammon, you heard me. Began constructing our citadel. Are you quite sure, sweet Leopold? You do realize you are talking to a scrawny little demon thing.
Still smiling, Leopold brought his cane down on the harpy with a rustle of red plumage and a pained shriek.
I'm not entirely sure I asked your opinion. Let's try that again. Build, Mammon.
Settling himself onto a rock on the ground, and resting his hands on his cane, Leopold stared with a rapidly diminishing smile as the harpy to his right stared at him dumbfounded and angry, and the demon in front of him began to clumsily gather supplies. But night came quickly, and the exhausted Mammon had barely managed to construct even the beginnings of a wall, pilfered from the stone skeletons of whatever buildings had existed before. Shaking his head in disappointment, Leopold reached into the pockets of his smoking jacket, right hand tense as he found what he was looking for.
Unfortunately, time is up. Why don't the two of you go somewhere else for a while? I'll take care of this myself.
His tone was dismissive. But Mammon did just that, running for a few moments to put enough distance between the old man and himself as possible. A cautious beat of wings alerted him to her presence even before he saw Crimsolino. Neither of them said anything.
I suppose that's for the best, hey? I mean, I wasn't doing that great a job at this myself, what with these guns?
Mammon tried to make a joke, but it fell flat, and Crimsolino refused to respond with laughter, even dismissive laughter.
It's not so bad, I think. We'll probably profit comfortably out of this. We'll just have to wait and see, I'm sure.
She murmured, and at a loss for how to respond, Mammon finally simply settled on saying nothing, joining her in staring off into the now blue-black distance. He could see quite well in the dark, and strange shapes, tall and vaguely humanoid, carved from granite or perhaps having grown from the rock itself, watched the two of them cautiously, neither hostile nor friendly. And yet, one rolled towards them, smaller than Mammon and rounder as well. Its stone-like surface was less polished and worn than the older stone beings, and it looked up at them without visible eyes or facial features. Crimsolino managed to recover herself enough to hiss, smoke and fire at the edge of her fangs, but her heart wasn't in it. Instead, the little stone thing rolled back and forth, and after a while, the two realized it was laughing. Perhaps at them, or perhaps at themselves. But as it laughed, the other stone folk rolled towards them, cautiously. A few circled Crimsolino, who stuck her wings behind her, kept her neck high, and refused to meet their gaze. Then they rolled away, and with a shrug, Mammon began to follow them. Crimsolino preferred not to walk, but did so anyway, leaving talon marks fresh and stark in the ground. For the stone folk led them into a maze of holes in the cliffside, where flight would only lead to a concussion at best. But the insides of the stone tunnels were coated in precious jewels and something that was like an organic mortar. Mammon's greed was apparent, though the back of his mind cautioned him pragmatically enough that yanking them out would be about as hard as building a keep without tools, training, or physique, and possibly worse. Not to mention possibly bringing the tunnels down on them, but hey, little things. All the gemstones were translucent, almost more like cut glass than actual jewels. They shone with an unearthly reflective light, a kind of natural torch that shone the way as the two followed their stone-structured escorts down, into a great pit filled with fire and smoke. Mammon couldn't stop coughing, but Crimsolino cooed and took off into the air around the pit, laughing at her companion's misfortune.
It seems I misjudged them earlier. They have the right idea, don't they? Well, I dunno. Just seems like a bunch of rocks, to me.
Mammon began, as one of the large stone people brought him a carved slate tray laden with fruit-accented beverages and crusty bread.
But, hey, you know. Rock on.
With the outside night completely forgotten, the two partied wildly with the stone folk until the fire had grown unfed, its mineral green flames dying in a slow gout that sparkled into the air, and then left the chambers all but darkened. Around them, most of the rock people had rolled up into small clutches, sleeping peacefully. Or something like sleep. They occasionally shook in their inactivity, their stone forms shifting through a wheel of colors as they did. From high above on the ceiling, Crimsolino hung from a stalactite clumsily. It was a rather terrible roost, but it was better than lazing about on the floor, and she preferred to keep an eye on things, regardless. Like Mammon, who wasn't sleeping, but merely throwing a coin into the air, back and forth, puzzled. Finally, she sighed and decided to ask anyway.
Whatever you're thinking. No, it's not that. It'd be nice to stay here for a while, but I imagine that'd just make the boss man more sore. Let's keep to ourselves for now, and leave before the morning sets in. I dunno if we should thank these guys or something, but it seems like they're just glad to have company. I mean, they're rocks. I am having the hardest time getting a read on them. I'm sure even a heart of stone would be wounded by such callous words, dear Mammon. But, you know, it would be nice, wouldn't it?
Time passed, and for a while, Crimsolino assumed that Mammon had finally gone to sleep.
Are you planning on going back just because he mentioned your curse? I don't honestly think Guy's got a plan on how to fix it, to say nothing of his great attitude. Maybe I am.
She shrugged, talons digging into the stalactite as it crumbled a little under her.
That is no business of yours, however. We both have a role to play here, and not doing so would be imprudent. Besides, you can surely recognize a good opportunity when you see one. I can only imagine that if this Leopold is successful, you will have more opportunity to take what treasures you see fit than ever before. Yeah, that does sound pretty nice, doesn't it? But what about?
But what about the respect of it all? What about the fun of adventuring with someone you enjoyed spending time with, knowing they'll patch you up if you get hurt, and you'll do the same for them? What about not worrying about trying to settle or rule over a land, and just seeing what it has to offer? What about the gold you find locked in a musty old chest that turns out to just be really grody old cheese? What about being friends? Mammon wanted to shout back, but the words never found the strength to break free, and he finally closed his eyes while wishing he weren't such a damn coward.
Good night, dear Mammon. Don't think about things too much. It shall be much easier for both of us if we just decide not to think. I think.
Laughing, Crimsolino went quiet, as did the cave itself. She was unable to sleep, however. The dripping of the stalactites onto the chalky white floors below, smoothed by hundreds of the rotund stone people, distracted her. She tried to remember an old story she had been told when she was but an heir-in-waiting, and nothing more. A story about a woman lost in a great woods, who was sent to the court of a cruel king. The dripping splattered against the ground. And she was hungry, of course. Only peasants ate things like bread or leaves, true ladies craved meat, raw and uncooked, that could be gulped down the gullet with enough blood to wash it down by half. Well, she might have cooked it back in the day of course, but it suited this terrible form well enough. Now the dripping was almost rhythmic, familiar. Maybe she could eat Mammon. It would be a betrayal, of course, and she would regret it, but he asked too many questions, and it would be better than eating one of the stone people, though not by much. The former was too stringy, the latter too rocky. Why couldn't they raise some kind of underground cattle? It had stopped for a moment. She felt the tension leave as whatever sixth sense had been trying to warn her calmed down, slightly. She had been frightened about falling asleep. The giver of her curse, a terrible old hag, had caught her off guard once before. She didn't want to be caught off guard again, whether by an old hag or an old man. Why wasn't there an equivalent word for that? Geezer? Would geezer work? And her dreams were unkind. In her dreams, she wasn't some disgusting bird, but refined, and beautiful once again. She was not cursed to follow friends that beat her, and allies that relied on her simply because there was no one else to rely on, but servants who responded to her every whim. Castellans that composed ballads for her. Chefs that understood a lady's craving for large portions of dead animal. Perhaps the latter part had been a bit greedy, true, but she would give it up to return to the former. And have a decent smoke that wasn't the smoke from her own fire. The dripping returned, drip, drip, drip. Crimsolino tried to shutter her ears with her wings, and caught angrily in indignation. Had she still been a duchess, she'd have sent a nice gift to the stone people for their hospitality. Nothing fancy, perhaps a box of chocolates or something. Maybe a tiny statue of herself, so that they could remember her presence among them. Most assuredly the happiest day of their strange, silicon-based lives. Then she would have issued an edict that forever banned stalactites from dripping. That sounded about right. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes unlidded hastily, darting around the inky blackness. That hadn't sounded like water, nor had it sounded like Mammon snoring. It was a familiar sound, and she had come to dread it. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping of a cane echoed throughout the large chamber, none of the stone folk rousing from their sleep. Crimsolino began to squawk loudly, screeching as she fluttered around the groggily awakening Mammon in a rustle of red and gold.
Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! He's coming, Leopold is coming. We should leave quickly, and go right now. No time, let's go.
But a pale lantern light shone semicircles onto the cavern walls, even as a familiarly deep voice whistled the half-remembered lyrics to some unfamiliar tune. Leopold strode into the cavernous hall, beaming from ear to ear.
I knew if I left you two alone for a while, something interesting might happen. And look what you found me, how splendid.
Crimsolino stopped fluttering and immediately smiled in return, wondering if it was less sickly than she felt.
Your tracks were unhidden, Harpy, and you left your card in front of the cavern. Still, this will do nicely. One never can have enough new servants.
His laughter was loud and raucous as it echoed around the cavern halls around them, and outside an all-consuming rain began to fall. Chapter end.